Happy Friday, guys, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Dubs. I'm your host, Bill T. Well, it's Friday. It's a little late, but I'm getting you guys out a podcast this week, and it's a good one. If you guys are into punk rock history, the guy that we've got on the podcast today, John Maher, is the drummer for a band called the Buzzcocks, one of the first pop punk bands that was out there. And they actually opened for the Sex Pistols at the Sex Pistols debut show. So that's kind of their claim to fame. Tons of good songs. Go do a deep dive on Apple Podcasts and check out the Buzzcocks Essentials. I was never huge into them, and I just started listening to them over the past week. And there's a couple of popular songs that you'll know if you listen to early punk rock music, but they've got a lot of cool songs. So go check them out and get into it. And the best part, you might be thinking to yourself, why do you have the drummer for the Buzzcocks? Well, because John Maher, who's the drummer for the Buzzcocks, is one of the top engine builders that's in all of the UK. Now, he's been in the Volkswagen scene since the early 80s, and he started out doing mobile repair out of his panel bus, eventually got a workshop, and then started building engines for people, and then got into drag racing. So he was early in the influential stages of the Volkswagen drag racing scene in the UK. And you may remember from listening to John Brewster's podcast, all about the early days of the VW drag racing scene in the UK. So we go through a lot of that history, and we talk about how he built that up, the transition from being in a punk rock band at an early age into getting his first Volkswagen, and then why he ended up starting his own repair and his repair shop mainly. So it's a great podcast. You guys will really enjoy it. It's a long one because towards the end I start asking some questions a little bit about his days in the punk rock scene. So we don't get too in depth into that. More ask him a little more off the wall questions because he's got a ton of interviews out there. If you want to go check him out, go check out his YouTube channel at John Maher. So search that and look at the spelling in the title of the podcast because we pronounce it Maher, and you'll see that at some point he gets me on the straight and narrow about how to pronounce his name correctly. So make sure you guys go check out his YouTube channel and go give him some support. And don't forget to support, speaking of that, our sponsors. That's VW Trends Magazine. Go subscribe today at vwtrendsmagazine.com. And also Ross Wolf, high performance aftermarket parts built by VW enthusiasts for VW enthusiasts. So go check them out at rosswolf.com. That's Wolf with a U. And go support the people that support your podcast. And don't forget, you want to support the podcast, get a shout out, pick up some merch, or give us a review on Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to give us 5 stars. So without any further ado, guys, let's get into it this week. Punk rock drummer turns to Volkswagen engine builder and drag racer. On today's podcast, we're going to get into it with John Maher from John Maher Racing on this week's Let's Talk Dubs.
You probably don't know that there's a new Volkswagen out that doesn't look like a Volkswagen. The bug like. So if you happen to see a good-looking Volkswagen, don't panic.
On today's podcast, we're going to go ahead and go across the pond again, and then we'll go across one further pond because the gentleman we're speaking to today, he lives on an island, off an island. So he's out near the middle of nowhere. And on today's podcast, we're going to have John Maher from John Maher Racing. Now, John Maher, for some of you that may not be familiar here in the States, was very influential in the drag racing, the origins, a lot of the drag racing starting in the UK in the early 80s and so on. What you may also know him from is he was the drummer for a band called the Buzzcocks. And he's the guy that over time became the person that you would go to have an engine built, a performance engine built in the UK. He's got a reputation of building really fast motors, and I'm excited to get him on the podcast today. Let's welcome John Maher with John Maher Racing.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thanks for the invite.
Well, the way we always start now we got a lot of history to cover, right? You started out in an early punk rock band. After that, got into the VW scene, and then you've got a long storied history in the Volkswagen scene. And the way that we always start the podcast is, what's your VW story and how did you get into Volkswagens?
My first car wasn't a Volkswagen. When I was 17, I got, well, my dad helped me, we got a thing called an Austin 1100, which probably isn't familiar to most American folks. And it was purely a means for me to drive around, get from A to B. I didn't take any interest in that car at all. And when I got the first payment from the band, the band had been going about 2 years, and we'd released an EP independently, and we each got £1,000, and I decided I would use that £1,000 to buy a better car than the Austin 1100, and I wasn't specifically looking for a Volkswagen Beetle, but I spotted one that I could afford, and for some reason it really appealed to me. It was actually a 1303S Super Beetle. I bought that, and then for some reason, the ownership of that car inspired me to try and learn much more about it. I started acquiring, that Complete Idiot book, the John Muir book, learned an awful lot through that. And just generally, for some reason, took a real interest in this Volkswagen Beetle, and got hands on with it. Started to do my own servicing and repairs and so on, and that's something weird about the Volkswagen that just got me really into pursuing the whole thing. Accumulating books, because we didn't have internet back then, so the knowledge. It was a little difficult to acquire the knowledge, but I was fortunate that there was an old guy who lived just down the street from my parents' house, and he had an old split window van, and had like a lock-up garage around the back of the street that he had. He just had a mountain of Volkswagen spares he'd accumulated over the years. And that ultimately, I ended up taking over that lock-up garage. That became the first premises for me when I started actually working on Volkswagens.
Now, so one of the questions I have, because everybody thinks like, well, how does a guy who's, in a band then go into doing mechanical stuff? And well, I think we asterisk it with, it's a punk rock band, so it wasn't like, you guys were Led Zeppelin, right? So you guys made a few bucks, and then you transitioned to that. But did you find yourself particularly mechanically inclined before this? Was it kind of a necessity thing? You started working on your old Volkswagen, and then you realized, hey, I've got kind of a knack for this, so let me go forward with this, or let me pursue this as a career, or the band was over? Like, how does that transition happen?
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I got the Volkswagen while I was in the band. I think the main thing that prompted me to get more seriously into, in particular, working on the engines, was there was a point. It would be around about 1979, 1980, and we were going away on a tour. And by this point, I was a regular. The main Volkswagen magazine in the UK at the time was a thing called Safer Motoring, and it wasn't a hot rod magazine at all. It was basically pretty boring type of stuff that was in it. But in the readers' pages, every month there'd be these letters about people talking about the famous dropped valve. And I started getting paranoid about, my engine was coming up for 75, 80,000 miles. And I thought, this thing's going to start dropping valves. It's while I'm away on this tour, we were away for about a month. I left the car in with a workshop in Manchester and asked them to basically recondition the engine and make sure that the valve side of things was sorted out. I got the car back, and within within a few days or a week or so of getting the car back, I was driving through Liverpool one night, and somebody behind me started flashing the lights at me, and then the engine cut out. And actually what had happened is the engine had gone on fire. I presume must have been a fuel hose they hadn't put back on properly, or it was, for whatever reason, this thing went on fire. And I vowed from that point on, there's no way that a Volkswagen of mine is going into a garage again. So from that point, I think that made me took the whole engine side of things and tearing it apart and getting into the innards of the thing. Just took it real serious, and that carried me through the period with the band split in 81. I did a few musical things for a couple of years on and off after that, but ultimately came to the conclusion that earning a living by being a musician wasn't going to work for me. How else could I go about it? So this is where the Volkswagen thing basically took over completely.
Now, with your first Beetle being a Super Beetle, right? And this is in the early 80s, late 70s. Had the cow look thing started there in the UK? Because, here a lot of guys will start, their first car will be a Super Beetle, and they'll kind of get shamed by, they get that little bit of, it's not a pre-67 kind of thing. Was there a little bit of that happening back then, or was the UK scene just happy to have a Volkswagen that wasn't rusted to death and you guys were all your own little clique and this kind of thing? Or what was the VW scene like having a Super Beetle back in those days?
There wasn't really anything resembling a Cal look scene that I was aware of at that period. In fact, I remember the first time I ever went to a VW show was 1981, and that was a show called VW Action, and that was by far the biggest Volkswagen show in the UK at the time. And that basically consisted of an awful lot of people with Volkswagens assembling in this huge showground and basically just parking their vehicles up, and people wandering around looking at them. They'd have a concourse where they'd shook trophies for the best car of whatever year or best van. All the trade stalls were there. For me, and probably my contemporaries at the time, the most exciting thing probably about going to those shows was there was a small contingent of people that would come over from Europe. Certainly Germans with the German look thing. That's probably when I first became aware of, the German look. These Beetles would turn up, and often they were Super Beetles, because these guys were into handling as well as just flat out speed. And this is when I first started seeing Type 4 motors in with the Porsche cooling on there. And as far as events that took place over the weekend, because this show would start like on a Friday night and run through to the end of Sunday.
Yeah.
That 1981 show, the most exciting thing I remember seeing was an engine change competition where basically teams of two people would take their Volkswagen Beetle. Oh, there you go, you got the picture. Yeah. And I said to myself that I would really like a piece of that. It must have been something about that perked my interest. And I'm not sure that I entered the following year, but certainly by 83, I was there with my brother-in-law, and we were having a crack at this engine change thing. And we came last, actually. But in the process, learned a lot of little tips and tricks, and ultimately ended up going back and getting the record.
Yeah, and what was the record?
So that was about as exciting as those shows got.
And what was the record for pulling up?
The record. The record that we established was. I'm aware that they do this competition. I don't know if it's a thing anymore. It certainly used to be back in the day. And I know from other magazine articles I've seen from Australia and some of the shows in America where they used to do this kind of thing, that the rules are different. So it's difficult to say that our time would compare with the guys in America, say. Because what we had to do was start behind the car. You would, on the signal to go, I'd jump into the car, back it up ramps. The other guy would be undoing the stuff on the top of the engine, in the engine bay. I went underneath, did the stuff underneath, and then we literally just grabbed hold of the tailpipes, pulled the engine, and as soon as it touched the floor, the clock stopped. So we had a separate one time for pulling the motor out. Then there'd be a little break while you get your breath back, and then on the word go, you'd be able to lift the engine up, get the jack in, put it in, bolt it up in place, hook up the electrics and the fuel and so on, jump in and drive forward 1 meter. And so we got, I think it was 20 seconds for removing the engine and 56 seconds to get the thing back in and drive forward 1 meter, at which point the judge would come and check the tightness on the 4 nuts that are holding the thing in, make sure all the cables were connected as they should be. So yeah, a total of 1 minute 16, I believe.
That's that's hugely impressive, and at the bug-in days over here, that's one of the things they do. They do that. They do the slalom. They had a bunch of different competitions, and for you to gravitate towards the competitive side of like, well, I think I can do that, and it kind of it goes back to the testament of the Volkswagen owner, right? A lot of us are do-it-yourselfers. We believe that we can get some things done. The cars are easy enough to work on where we can do some things. With that, is that when you start your shop, like, are you working on friends' cars and things like that first, and you're just helping your buddies? You're like, you know what the heck? I'll just start a shop. Obviously, the music thing's too spotty for me. I need something a little more consistent. I like this Volkswagen thing, so I'm going to take over my, this guy's parts, this guy's shop, and just start doing engines. I mean, at that point, when you start doing that, have you rebuilt motors up to this point, or you're just kind of fumbling your way through it, or what?
When I started my VW business, if you like, which was called Mr. Beetle, it was before I got hold of that little workshop, and I was just going around doing servicing and brakes, even clutches. And I was using a bay window bus as I was mobile. I just went around putting leaflets, or drove around Manchester, found any air-cooled Volkswagen and put a leaflet under the windscreen wiper, and eventually, phone calls would come in, and then I'd be driving off around the inner and out of Manchester, going and working on these people's cars, wherever they worked or at their home or whatever. Ultimately, I got the workshop, and then, which is obviously much easier, but based everything from there. But it was a service and repair business, and the first engine that I actually rebuilt, it was one that was given to me by the guy I mentioned earlier that had the old split screen van.
Yeah.
He was quite encouraging. Gave me an old motor that he said had something wrong with it, and so I pulled it apart, and with the aid of the John Muir book, I can't remember what it was. I think it might have burnt a valve or something. So it did a real basic repair. He also had a little piece of chopped off gearbox bell housing that I could mount a starter on, and we also had a tiny little fuel tank off of a lawnmower. And so with a set of jump leads and a battery, once I'd put the engine back together and replaced the burnt valve and so on, we were able to just had it on the floor and just fired the thing up, got that amazing satisfaction you get, of course, when you've put an engine back together and it actually works.
Yeah. So you start with doing minor service and repair, and then, I mean, obviously you have a reputation in the UK for building high performance engines. What's your first high performance thing you start to do, and how big was the struggle in the UK to get high performance stuff?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of it. I remember in those early 80s, when we used to go to the shows, there was the big one was VW Action. There was another moderate sized show, which I believe is still going, Stamford Hall. And the trade stalls to make a beeline for was, especially if the guys from Micro Giant were there. That was a little VW business down in the south of England, run by a guy called Tony Royston. And he would, I'm not sure what form of motorsport he was into, but they always had some interesting stuff on their stall. And I do remember coming away with they had quite a nice little, like a DIY printed brochure, but it just had things in there that you just nobody else was doing. Then I know you've spoken to John Brewster on I think that was a relatively recent podcast you did with him.
I did.
And I listened to that. Yeah. And of course, John was big with Autocavan. And Autocavan going through certainly into the mid 80s, they were getting like quite a sizable operation, and they were also getting into the performance side of things. So you would suddenly start seeing some scat products. I'm not sure if they did bug pack as well, but certainly some interesting stuff, because they were involved with some autocross, I believe, was something that you were more likely to see a Volkswagen Beetle involved in. In the motorsport side of things, autocross seemed to be the thing, but it was not something that I ever really knew about or didn't actually come across until we started bumping into the likes of Autocavan and so on. But as far as getting into building the performance engines, I think I had, by virtue of going to some of these shows, I had bought a set of twin carburetors and I think it looked like a Geenberg crossbar linkage, but I don't think it was the genuine article. It looked like a copy of one. And I bought these 40 IDFs and I put them onto a 1600 engine that by this time I'd convinced my dad that he needed to be driving a Volkswagen Beetle as well. And so he was driving around for a little while with a 1600 twin carb Beetle. There was a great VW breakers in Manchester called GT Auto Spares, and I went along to see him one day. Jeff Green was the guy's name, sadly no longer with us, and he had a 1957 Oval in the yard there, and it didn't. It looked too good to be getting broken up, and he had it up for sale. I ended up buying that off of him. And my intention was to turn that into a street car. I'd bought a 74mm crank because I was prepared to dive into the world of stroker motors, but I was a bit nervous of going, too big a stroke. So I took it easy. I went with a 74mm, bought some 90.5mm barrels and pistons. But this was just before the first ever Bug Jam in 1987. And I went down to that Bug Jam, and that was the first time I saw some, moderately quick VWs going. First time I'd ever been to a drag strip, in fact. And then overnight that was changed. This was no longer going to be a street car. I was going to come back to Bug Jam the next year, assuming there would be one. Of course, that happened. I was coming back with a race car.
Yeah. So you saw the high performance stuff and you're like, that's it. I'm going to do some of that. Like I can do the maintenance stuff, but for me, I want to do the racing.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the amazing things about that first Bug Jam, it was, having started going to VW shows in 81, you got used to the fact that these were fairly staid events. There wasn't a lot of action taking place at these. Suddenly, somebody decided to put a VW drag race on at Santa Pod Raceway. Yeah. And this was, it was almost, I almost equated it to like the punk explosion in 76, right. 77. When you had to just be there at the start of this is the initiation of a movement.
Yeah. And
the excitement that comes with that. Well, that very first Bug Jam, and the excitement that was centered around that event, and then there was somewhere and something going on for all these VW people to get together. It was like, yes, you're at the start of something fresh and exciting. Yeah, again,
And so that's the first time that there was drag racing in the UK, and you're there seeing it go down. Is that the first time that's a VW only drag racing event?
That's the first time there was ever a VW only drag racing event. But then we became aware, because of course there were some VWs. Well, there was a whole run what you brung thing, so people were taking all sorts of stuff down the track. But there were some dedicated drag cars. I remember one of them was Bernie Smith, that Keith mentioned in his chat with you. Uh-huh. And I remember there was a Carmen Gear there as well, which wasn't running that great, but there was just enough of it going on. And plus, by this time, I started picking up copies of Hot VW, so I was aware of what was going on in California. And to see that there was we're getting a little taste of this now over in the UK.
Sure.
And you think, we had the inspiration of what kind of car I might like to build through the likes of VW Trends and Hot VWs. And now you have the opportunity to, well, if you build a car, there's going to be somewhere to race it as well. So that was amazing.
And the first motor you put, so you're going to build, you got this oval and you're like, I'm going to make this a race car. So what's your first time on the track? What do you bring to race?
Okay, so in '87 there was just that one Bug Jam event, and because of the success of that, in '88 there were 3 events put on. I can't remember what month that the first was, but I wasn't ready for that. I was ready to get down to Bug Jam, the second Bug Jam in '88. My car was in a mix of white primer on the body shell and black. The wings were black, so it hadn't had its paint job yet. But I managed to go down the track. I think the best I managed that first time out was low 13s, possibly dipped into the 12s maybe.
Wow.
And I'd not been down a drag strip before, so this was all new, and I'm not even sure if I'd had the tracking on the front end done or anything. It was all so, last minute to try and get ready for Bug Jam. But having got ready for that second Bug Jam, which I believe was I think that was in the July, the third event of the year, back at Santa Pod again, very much in the vein of Bug Jam, but it was called the German Car Company Summer Nationals. In that gap between July and September, I managed to get my car painted, got the lettering on it, and now to me, this was more like something I'd been looking at on the pages of Hot VWs. And as it happened, that weekend was great, because that was I guess it might be a little bit of a showbiz. That's the car there, Mr. Beetle. I really wanted the thing to pull wheelies, which probably sounds a bit childish, but going back to that era, I don't think anybody in the UK had seen a Volkswagen pull the front end up off the ground. So as it happened, it was pulling wheelies all weekend, and it was, of course, that went down a storm with the crowd, so that was really satisfying. And then ultimately came away with the trophy for that weekend for the modified class.
And that car,
that was a real highlight.
And that car, first time on the track, you're cracking a 13-second quarter mile.
Yeah. By that time, I think I stepped up a little bit in between, dropping the idea of it being a street car. Mm-hmm. I stepped up to a 78 mil crank and 94s. So it was a 78.4. There was a by this time, a place had opened up in about 15, 20 miles outside Manchester, called Limited Edition. And they had started selling like Baja buggy kits and off-road type stuff, but then found that there was a little gang of people going along there every Saturday because they were interested in the Cal look side of things, more street racy sort of stuff. And they were shipping a lot of stuff in from Johnny Speed and Chrome. Remember them?
Yeah.
And that's where my 78.4 mil crank came from, which didn't last too long. That's another. We can get into that as I started to upgrade things, out of necessity.
So what was in 1988, a 13-second pass is fast. It's relatively on the much faster side of kind of guys for their first time out, for sure. Because I think we start in street cars, go out there, beat it up, 1600, 1776, dual carburetors, that kind of stuff. And then to go out there and run that motor, a 13-second pass. What was the setup on that motor? So that motor had the 78 crank, and then your first time out, what's the setup? 48s? What do we got? Compression, cam, what do we got?
Yeah, it was 48s, 48 IDAs, inch and 5/8 exhaust with a stinger on. Had no cooling. It was a pure drag car, so there were no lights or anything on the car. Flip front, but it was. I put the oval body onto it was a ball joint floor pan, so it'd be like a 68, 69 floor pan. Mm-hmm. Fiberglass rear wings, still had the original steel doors. Did the interior? The interior door panels were thin aluminium. still had the original glass front screen and rear screen. Used perspex for the side windows. So I don't know what the actual weight was. The cage that was in there, I built that myself. Yeah, that was weird. I did that I bought the class legal tube. I think I went a bit over the top. I used 1 3/4. I could have used 1 5/8, but I couldn't find 1 5/8 seamless tube. And I didn't have a proper tube bender. So the one I rented was what they call a bow and arrow bender. I've heard it described as. And if you just put got the tube and you put that in the bender and started pumping and to put the bend in, it would kink the tube. So I had a chat with a local, relatively local guy who'd actually built a jet truck. He was like a bit of a hot rod. Fred Whittle was his name, and he was like the local hot rod guru. So I asked him for a bit of advice, and he said, "Yeah, get some dry sand, put a wooden cork in the end of the tube, fill it with the dry sand, get the oxyacetylene torch on where you want to bend it, and then pump the bender, and you won't kink the tube." So that's how the roll cage was made.
I mean, talk about it's the archaic way. I mean, that's like the hot rodder's way, right? You start out just figuring things out on your own because you don't have the expensive tools or the equipment, and then the sheer determination. Like instead of just scrapping it and calling somebody, having them fab it, you're like, there's got to be a way I can figure this out on my own.
Yeah, I mean, I do often look back at those days, and it's your fault. In the last few days since you contacted me, it's prompted me to go looking back at some of the old photos, and it's got me thinking, God, if I knew back then what I know now,
yeah,
I think there's probably some of the things I wouldn't have dared do. But when you're clearly just so obsessed with getting this job done. And you don't know the rules, so you don't know that you're breaking rules to do what you're doing. Weren't no engine dyno or anything like that back then, but it was just that sheer enthusiasm and just dedication. Let's get this done and get it down to the track and race it.
So speaking on that, what's the most ridiculous thing that when you're looking back over these past years and you said, I can't even believe I would put that down the track? Like what kind of things did you do just for sheer this might work? I don't know. No research, no nothing. Let's just throw it, see if it sticks.
Oh wow! Well, maybe not quite in that vein, but I do remember that when I first put the engine in, and I fired it up, and right, this thing's working, and all the wheels were on. Took it out the alleyway onto the street. And it's not a really wide street, and there's cars parked both sides. So you've got enough room to drive a car down between the two lines of cars with probably a couple of feet either side. And I thought I'll just want to give it a little blip just to feel what this thing's like, because I had a 4-puck disc in there and I'd never known what that was like. What the really stupid thing was I didn't have the seat in. I had like a toolbox. I was sat on top of a toolbox. And of course, I blipped the throttle, and the steering wheel, I hadn't put the nut on the column.
Oh, wow.
So the steering wheel flew off the column, and I went back into the back of the car where the back seat should be. And fortunately, it stayed in a relatively straight line and slowed down without hitting anything out of the side,
But I mean, those are the days when you're just so excited to see, how does this perform? What does this thing do? What is, I was looking on your Facebook page and I noticed that you had a picture of Adam Wick's intake and all this kind of stuff that Adam Wick had built, like a dual plenum intake for twin 48s. Right. And I remember I'd done Adam's local here. And the first time I asked him just at his shop or just BSing, and I said, what made you start building your own motors? He goes, well, I got tired of paying everybody else to do it. And then I figured out they're just making it up. Why can't I just make it up too? And it was just this funny thing of where everybody's starting to drag race in this archaic technology that's been left by the wayside for years by modern automotive industry. And there's this group of maniac VW people that are like, we're going to take this antiquated technology of an air-cooled, horizontally opposed motor that Porsche and everybody's moved on from, and we're going to squeeze as much power out of these things as possible. And so it's this whole thing of just guys trying whatever they think. Now, with you guys in the UK, who were you, like, who are the guys in your circle that you guys are swapping ideas? Is it a real competitive time, or are all the drag racers sticking together and looking at what they're doing in the States and then trying to bring that technology over? Like, how is that first early VW drag scene like in the UK as far as competitiveness, sharing knowledge, helping each other, and getting new developments?
Yeah, I think I guess this is probably true of lots of forms of motorsport. There's are quite guarded about super special, and they don't want you to really know about what they're doing. But most of them, quite happy to have a chat with you. But I think what I found, I mean, you probably noticed on the some of the early pictures of that green car at that first meeting when it was in paint, as I sort of, to be fair, there weren't that many people in that modified class that year. There just weren't enough cars of that kind of speed. So when I say I won the final, I probably beat 4 people maybe at top most. But I became aware of the fact that the Terry's Beetle services were there. They were really big into using nitrous. I think Keith Zoom he was racing in Super Street then, and he was a nitrous guy. John Brewster was nitrous as well. We started to see a couple of turbo engines appear, and then so just sort of not intending to be provocative, but just making a little bit of a statement. I was really into the normally aspirated side of things, so we just wrote no nitrous, no turbo on the engine lid, and you kind of get great satisfaction out of the no nitrous, no turbo guy beating another car that might have the nitrous or the turbo on. So that became a little bit of a thing. But I think the cars, there were too few cars around, and in that modified class, and the fact that each person was really, they kind of had their own goals, like if you've got the turbo, you might be targeting a 10-second run or whatever. And so it was very difficult to make a good comparison between the cars because we were all so different. So that's basically why when the Volkswagen Drag Racing Club was formed, I guess it was made sense really that they turned that each class was bracket racing. So that meant the lesser powered. Well, you could all compete with whoever, regardless of what the spec was of the cars. I would have really liked it if we'd got enough cars going in the UK to be able to develop a heads-up class like the ultimately you did with the Pro Stockers in the VW equivalent of the Pro Stockers, which came about, I believe, in that must have been around 88, 89, I think, when that kicked off. And that's precisely the reason that when I ultimately crashed the green car, it got completely destroyed and I had to build a new race car. I was so inspired by the PRA Pro Stock thing that I decided I was build my own tube chassis and go down that route. And it was still bracket racing in the UK. There you go. That's it. Yeah, still bracket racing in the UK. But it was just my personal ambition at that time was to get that car to run 10 seconds, normally aspirated, which I did get there in the end. Did manage to dip into the tens.
And that's quite a high bar, 10 seconds naturally aspirated, especially in the late 80s, because that's pretty close to. That's in the area within a second or so what the guys are running in the States, yeah?
Yeah, it wasn't as quick as the guys in the States, but I was still running my 78 by 94 motor. That gives me the opportunity to step into. I actually went from the 78.4 crank that I was running previously, the Johnny Speed and Chrome. I ended up replacing with a Gene Berg 78mm because the Johnny Speed and Chrome crank ended up bent by about 3 or 4 thou and caused all sorts of problems. And then I just thought, threw in the towel. It's like, I'm going to get the best. I'm not messing about with this welded stroker stuff anymore. I want the best you can get. And it was a Berg Type 4 center main, wedge mate. We'll worry about paying the credit card bill off at a later date, but let's get a decent crank in there. And I suppose I wish maybe I'd gone for an 84 stroke 82, 84, but because I was already set up at a 78, I just thought I'll keep it simple. I'll just go with a 78. And I spent a little while running low 11s, and I was just that little bit away from dipping into the 10s. And of course, then started reading about people converting their 48 Webers to 51 or 51.5 mil.
Yeah.
So I bought the 51 mil butterflies from Berg. I think I bought them from Berg, and I machined the carbs out myself, installed them, and then of course this went down to a race thinking this is going to guarantee the 10-second pass, and as soon as I launched the car off the line, it just went on to 3. It sounded like it was on 3 cylinders. There was this horrible misfire. So, cut a long story short, I went back out on the track about 3-4 times, having tinkered with all sorts of things and could not eliminate this misfire. And of course, you chat to people in the pits and they're all offering their opinion, and you end up, you can't see the wood for the trees. And somebody had kind of convinced me or got it sewn into my head that there was a problem with the valve guides. There was leakage past the valve guides. And I actually took the heads off the motor, drove home that it was a Saturday, and then we were racing Saturday and Sunday. So I drove home, which was about 160 miles.
Oh, wow.
Drove home, went to the workshop, took all the valve guides out, put new valve guides in, did a fresh valve job, reassembled the heads, drove back down to the bed and breakfast we were staying. I got back there about 5:30 in the morning, got a couple of hours sleep, went straight back to the track quite early, put the heads on. I thought, this is it. This is going to be the 10-second run.
Right.
Took it to the start line, launched the car, and straight into that horrible misfire again. And it was soul destroying. So we're back at the pits, and I remember my dad was... my dad loved coming to the races with me, and he was trying to offer an opinion, but he's not really an engine super technical guy. Yeah. So I was kind of like, oh, shut up, Dad, shut up. And he says, well, the last thing you messed about with on that engine was the carbs. It must be the carbs. And I was just stood there staring at the down the door of one of the carbs, and I noticed that when you do that conversion to 51 mil, you do away with the little spring clip on the auxiliary venturi.
Yeah.
What I'd actually done, I put one of the auxiliary venturis in 180 degrees wrong. So, of course, when you come onto the main jet circuit, the fuel can't come through. So it was one of those moments where you just feel like absolutely banging your head against the brick wall, but at the same time, you're absolutely delighted because that's the problem. So it took like 2 minutes to flip that back round, straight back into the fire-up lane, and bang, 10.95.
Oh, wow. So that's the worst and best day, right?
Kind of worth it in the end. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and I noticed on this drag car that it looks like you had lengthened the front end as well. Is that right on this car? Because the front end on this car, it looks a bit longer than normal. I don't know if it's the picture, but maybe like you have an extended wheelbase. It
was. Let me think now. The wheelbase, I think it was 98 inch. Yeah. What stock is it? Yeah,
98 stock. Yeah. So
Okay, it was stuff. Yeah, it was weird because by doing the tube chassis, we were able to get the body lowered right down, much more so than on a like with a floor pan car. And I'll have to say the work on the front end was mostly done by a guy that works at this company called Limited Edition that I mentioned earlier, that were, the Johnny Speed and Chrome stockist, guy called Andy Howler. And he was really helped out with the bodywork, because bodywork certainly isn't my forte. And when it wasn't a deliberate thing, it was just purely that when the fiberglass front end was positioned on the chassis, it's like, this doesn't look right. To get the wheels look right in the cutouts.
Yeah,
it needs lengthening. So yeah, it got lengthened. Likewise with the rear wings were moved up on the body quite an amount, because you can see how close they are to the rear window.
Yeah. So the whole process there of building these tube cars, I mean, over there in the UK, you don't really have other cars to go look at unless people are importing cars to the UK, right?
That's right. Yeah. I think, let me think now. I think the first time in connection with VWs that I went to the US was in 88, 89. This is when I hooked up with Dick Nuss and Bill Duncan at Engine Machine Service.
Yeah.
You must know those guys.
Yeah, Duncan and Nuss, yeah.
Okay, I'll backtrack a bit here, because these they very important part in my VW history, Dick and Bill. That when I decided that I wanted to convert what was going to be the street car into a race car, it's like, where can I get my information from? Now, I was buying hot VWs, and I kept seeing this VHS tape advertised, How to Hot Rod Your VW Engine, I think it was called. And there was a little, like a fanzine type of publication appeared in the UK around about that time. It was called... I can't remember the name of it now. It was a guy called Andy Parrott that put this out, a real sort of enthusiastic VW guy that was very much into the quality side of things. And he took it upon himself to get permission to put this VHS tape out in the UK, because, of course, the video formats are different, aren't they? I think you're NTSC and we are PAL, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And so I was possibly one of very, very few people who ordered the VHS tape from Andy, and I just watched that over and over and over again. And one night, there was some technical question I had in my head, and I was thinking, who can answer this? And I plucked up the courage to ring Engine Machine Service, and I couldn't believe how helpful they were. I think they must have maybe thought, yeah, the guy sounds like he's really trying his best, and whatever. For whatever reason, they just gave me like loads of advice. And of course they became, I tried not to pester them too much, but every so often something would crop up, and I thought, I can't think of anyone in the UK that I can ask this question of that will give me the answer I want. And so I kind of got to know them over the phone. And I always swore that the minute I get to a point where I can afford to buy some decent cylinder heads, Dick Nuss is the guy that's going to do them for me. And so ultimately, when I decided to sell the main drum kit that I'd used through the Buzzcocks years, I sold that to another Manchester band, and I got onto Dick Nuss, and I asked him to do me a set of Superflow heads, specifically to suit my race motor. And so I felt far less guilty about phoning them up and asking questions at that point.
Yeah, you felt like you had paid to be a customer, and now this is some customer support you can get.
Exactly. I wanted to be a proper customer rather than just a pain, ringing them up all the time. And so I skipped forward then to about 89. I actually went over to Los Angeles. No, I'll tell you what it was. It was Buzzcocks had split in 1981. And then somebody approached us about getting back together and doing a month-long tour in the US. And this cropped up shortly after I had crashed the green car, and I already was planning the new tube frame car.
Yeah.
And I mean, we obviously we got paid for doing the tour, but it wasn't a huge amount. But it was like, yeah, I was feeling a bit sorry for myself. I crashed my car. I need some new parts. The tour thing came along, and I thought I'm going to get over to the States. As it happened, the end of the tour, we finished up in California. And rather than go back to the UK with the band, I decided to stay on for, I think I stayed on for the best part of a week. And first thing I did when we arrived in Los Angeles was get a taxi over to Engine Machine Service and meet these guys in person. And then, of course, that became like a long-standing friendship, really. But the brilliant thing was that I got to see, we went round to Jimmy Larson's house, where he was building. He had a chassis on his Jeep there in his home garage. And of course, I took loads of pictures of how he built that car. I think Bruce, who was working with Engine Machine Service then, he had a tube frame car lying around. I got the opportunity to photograph that. So I just came back with, you know, this was the information that I had to work off of.
And, you know, when you're out there in the States and so the interesting dichotomy, right, is you go out there as a quote unquote famous guy from the Buzzcocks, right? And people are excited to come see your band play. And yet you're the drummer there and you're excited to go see a machine shop and go see the stuff these guys are working on and just get something for a personal endeavor that you're doing back home to get your car a little bit faster and to hit the track. But I find it interesting that, you know, it's all different perspectives of what side of the line you're standing on. But, you know, there's people excited to see you and then you're excited to see, you know, Duncan and Nuss and go to their shop and kind of, you know, meet these guys in person, you know? So, you know, when you see these guys over there, what's the biggest difference that you notice when you start looking at the drag scene and all that stuff in the States? What's the biggest, anything you stumble across where you're like, wow, this is going to change things for me?
It was the quantity of the cars. Obviously, you had a lot more cars in the various classes. But it was, yeah, I think some of the innovation that you saw, you know, like to me, you mentioned already that plenum manifold that Adam Wick had built, and I saw Jim Larson. There was one on the when we went round to Jim Larson's house, the car that was in his workshop there had a plenum that he'd fabricated, and of course I was grilling Dick Nuss and Bill Duncan about what's the whole thing about here, and I think what you got maybe in the UK is that a lot of people that got into the Volkswagens it was like for me the first vehicle that I got into in any technical way was the VW air-cooled engine. So I had no outside knowledge of the way you know, like a Honda would work or a V8 and that, you know, that kind of thing. So whereas certainly when you're dealing with people like Dick Nuss, you don't have that kind of tunnel vision. They've got experience with other forms of vehicle, and the plenum idea that they were trying at the time, I don't think it ever really took off. But the idea was the motors were getting so big and the heads were flowing so well that the air, the carburation could not deliver sufficient air to meet the engine's demand. And one way around that was to take that sort of V8 approach, really, where you've got two. I think Jim Larson's plenum setup actually had a pair of, they were either 40s or 44s, and of course at first glance to me I thought, how the hell can you get away with a pair of 40 Webers when people are saying 48 IDAs aren't big enough, or 51s maybe not even big enough? And of course it's the whole principle upon which it works, because the plenum, when the intake valve on number one opens, it's not pulling purely from one barrel, it's pulling from the accumulation of all four. You know, so it's that concept. But I think the part of the reason why people maybe gave up on it is that the individual, those runners from the plenum on a Volkswagen engine, because of the layout of the engine, are necessarily so much longer than they are on a V8 engine.
Right.
And I remember Dick Nuss telling me, or Bill was telling me, that when they tried one of those plenum style engines on the dyno, it would make great power on the dyno. It would do the business, but when you put it in the car, it wouldn't leave the start line.
Because it just couldn't muster up enough torque to get going.
That's right. Yeah, but it was so lazy off the start line that it just destroyed the 60 foots. Therefore, when you're in a competitive heads-up class, it ain't going to work.
Yeah, and when you're talking about technology and development and things to that extent, and then you guys are over there in the UK and you're just limited with resources and things to do. And then, I mean, even here, as big as the VW drag scene is here, it's still so sparsely spread out. And at a car show, let's say you go to a car show and there's 1,000 people there and there's 400 cars, where there's 25 drag cars, the rest are show cars. And it's such a subsegment of a subsegment that even here, it's difficult for it to get momentum. We've seen some things recently with like the Volks group, and then there was Fast Four Cartel, the Volks group. They've tried BRS, the Bugrama Racing. They've tried the PR. They've had so many different factions with drag racing and tried so many different things that as a drag racer, it's like you're part of this exclusive group that are only these guys that get it, that it's hard work to get that 10-second pass. And you do all this work, months and months of work for 10 seconds, And so there's definitely got to be some of that camaraderie with you guys, especially the guys that were part of now, what was the drag racing? It was the VW DRCA. Is that what it was called over there in the UK?
VW DRC, yeah.
The VW DRC. So a lot of the guys that were there that started this originally, there's a lot of, is there a younger scene that's getting into it over there, or is it primarily street cars that people are building nowadays?
Nowadays, I'll be honest with you, I don't really know, because I haven't actually been to an event in a long, long time, partly because of where I am.
Yeah.
But I suppose I'm just like turned into one of those weird guys that lives out in the middle of nowhere, just does his own thing. And I don't even see customers anymore. Although, having said that you'll like this, I was at the workshop this afternoon, and I became aware I was looking at something on the computer in the office, and I became aware of someone hovering around at the roller shutter door. So I went out to see what he wanted, and he turns out he's a big Volkswagen enthusiast, and he knew I was there. And I happened to mention that, he started talking about he'd seen me back in the day at Santa Pod and whatever. And I says, well, it's funny you should say that, because I've been on a bit of a nostalgia trip myself the last few days because of you, Bill. And I mentioned that I was going to do this podcast tonight with this guy called Bill T. And he said, he follows your stuff,
Yeah.
So there's me thinking I'm out of the way, and I'm, but people still track you down.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of guys that when they have a workshop, they really, the tough part is because the VW, it's like being in a band, right? You go to practice, all your friends want to come hang out to watch the band practice, and you can't really practice because everybody's there, and it turns into a social scene. And it's the same.
Exactly.
My brother has a shop, and it's the same thing. He gets a bunch of people stop by and just soak up all the time. And so there's guys I know that just lock their shop so that they can work, and they say, hey, if you want to talk, show up at 5:30, or
yeah.
So it's,
and then you get accused of like having ideas above your station, and he doesn't want to talk to us anymore. And
yeah, no, it's interesting. And so doing that, the decision you made that since this is, and you're still doing the VW thing, still building engines, still doing all that stuff there in the Isle of Harris over there, and everything. Yep. Obviously, you're doing. You probably know the postman more than you know anybody else, right? Because you're constantly shipping things back and forth. But
pretty much.
The decision to move there, did you really think about, well, this could affect my business, and if it does, so be it. I really want to live in this tranquil place. What was the motivation to kind of to make that move?
I did think exactly that. That was the one thing that I thought would possibly work against me, is that I'm sure there's some people would decide, no, I don't want to get that guy to do it because it's just like, it's too far, it's too remote, I can't turn up and whatever. But fortunately, there's enough people that do. And as I was telling the guy that turned up this afternoon, I mean, I've been here 22 years now. And when I finished an engine and send it away, I have never sort of been stood there twiddling my thumbs wondering where the next one's coming from, because there's already like 3 or 4 in a line that are waiting to be done anyway. So, I'm not high volume by any means, but there's always another engine to do when the previous one's finished. So, I guess it's worked out, fortunately, that I can operate from here.
Now, and speak of that, so one of the ways I also had your name come across was, I was just at Volkswagen last year, and there was Irv's Restoration. His son has a black Beetle. That was a Beetle that was on your, when you had that, there was a TV program, Stars and Cars or something like that.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
Yeah. So that Beetle, so and here's the funny part, right? So that Beetle from this, hardly seen TV show that happens whenever, that was in for a 5-minute segment, if that, gets this lore behind it where it was like, oh, I bought that Beetle. And the funny part is, whether it's music or cars, these things that influence our passion, someone sees that, and then this particular vehicle gets a reputation. Now, was that a well-known Beetle back when you finished it, the black 54 right-hand drive? Or not really?
I mean, not really, not especially. No, that was it used to belong at the time when it was filmed for the program. There's a guy called Rob from Leeds. This is when I was still in Manchester, so it's that makes it a minimum of 23, 24 years old. That video, possibly older than that. Yeah, it's funny that the guy that presented that program is still on British TV, but he's got into motorbikes now, and he's got a completely different image. He looks like a greasy old biker with a beret on, and so.
But that was that car, that 54, that 54 Beetle, it just turned up last year, and the motor that's in it, 2332, I think it is, but it's one of these things where, it's got this kind of folklore about it of, oh yeah, this is this really fast street bug that was built, and it does these nasty burnouts. And so I was watching a thread on it, and someone put a post on the video and says, I tracked this bug down and I bought it. And then to see it rebuilt, and then,
wow.
It was just debuted, all completely restored last year at Volkswagen. I mean, it's impeccable.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And
wow. Yeah. That again, you're bringing back memories here. I mean, when back in the 90s, most of the engines that I built, I would say by far the most popular engine build was 1776.
Yeah.
And it was typically for youngish guys like Rob. Sadly, Rob is no longer with us. He passed a few years ago. Really, really nice guy, and would absolutely cane the living daylights out of that car. He got some great fun out of that car. I'm really delighted to hear that the car is still around. Just shows you how the scene has changed, because a lot of my customers back then were guys in their 20s, and it was always a Beetle. Well, typically 99% were Beetles. And they just wanted to drive around and be a menace around town, do burnouts and all that kind of thing. And then, of course, we've all got older, time marches on, and the number of conversations I've had in more recent years with guys who want to build a performance motor, but it's for a split-screen van or possibly a bay van, and they've got this fantastic excuse that it's not just for them because the whole family can go out and use it. It's so funny.
And so with motors you're building now, back in those days, you were building 1776s quite a bit. What's the typical motor you're building now?
Yeah.
Is it still range quite a bit, or is everybody going for the largest displacement? They want big drivers is what they're looking for now.
Yeah, nearly everything's over 2 liters now. But to be honest, if somebody rings me up and usually when people contact me now about an engine, they kind of know what I'm about, and you don't have to sort of, I don't have to try and persuade them that I'm the person to build their engine, which I wouldn't even enter into that anyway. But it kind of, you want torque, normally it's a driver. Very rare that I build anything that's purely race. That's I don't know when I last did that. So typically you're talking about a nice, torquey, powerful, drivable, something that's got to deliver good reliability as well. So for the bus guys, 82 by 90.5, 2110cc, and actually I'm increasingly, I think I'm almost on the verge of deciding that I will not do carbureted engines again. Fuel injection is what I like, and partly driven by quality of carburetors. But you buy brand new Weber carburetors today, and it's quite rare that you can put them on an engine and get the thing to actually idle evenly on all 4 cylinders. And I just think, I don't know whether it's the castings or the tooling's worn out or whatever, but the quality of those things is to the point where it's like, I don't want to see them ever again,
Now, do you have like your set of carburetors you break a motor in with and stuff that that they're set, they're ready, you put them on a car, they run? Or do you kind of build a motor complete for somebody, dyno tune it, and then ship them the motor?
Yeah, every motor is, it gets dynoed with the gear that's going to be on it when it's in the car. So it's partly... I wanted to get a dyno for a long... I bought the dyno in 1994, and it was, to a large extent, it was prompted by the fact that I was really intrigued by getting into fuel injection, and that's kind of, as with a lot of things, could probably point the finger of blame there at Gene Berg, because he was a big proponent of fuel injection back in the... I don't know if it certainly in the early 90s anyway. He was offering his Haltech stuff, and I thought, well, if I want to start doing fuel injection, I've got to be able to map these things, and if you want to map them, you need a dyno. So that's where the dyno came in, and it's one of the when I decided to give up racing, it was really prompted by the fact that I came to the conclusion that I probably wasn't the best person to get a car down to the track as fast as possible. But I was really into this, the technical side of building the engine and getting the results. And if I wanted to know whether the engine I built last time, the engine I'm building right now but it's the same spec as one I've done previously. I've done a couple of little mods. How do I know if it's actually any better or not? And I need to be able to measure the results, and the dyno is where that comes in. So every single engine gets dynoed, and that has allowed me over the years to accumulate an awful lot of data and knowledge as well, that if you decide to make a little tweak, is it a tweak, was it worth doing? Has it enhanced the performance? And then on that next engine, you might decide, okay, I'm going to do this a little bit different this time. So it's over the years, it's a very cumulative process. But I've seen, let's say, for example, because it's one of the most common engines that I've done over the years, a 2110cc mild motor, 40 by 35.5 valves. Might run through big bore heat exchangers. It's going in a bus, and the carbureted version, you end up going from something typically around 135 horsepower at the flywheel. Same sort of build now, especially if I put fuel injection on it instead, that could be 165 horsepower, and that's just through little changes, mainly to the heads. But If it was a carbureted one running on 40s, I'd probably be limited to right around 150.
And now, what fuel injection systems do you like that you're using?
Well, I decided that I'd like to use something that was available in the UK and something that I could get advice on rather than getting something from the US. And I knew of people that were running a system called DTA, and the guy who invented or created DTA was actually based in Manchester. I thought that's handy, so I contacted him. This is back in '94. A guy called Alan Warburton. And he invited me along to a dyno session where he was going to map an engine that was, he hadn't built the engine, but he was going to map it on behalf of somebody else. And it was his ECU. And he took the time I stood looking over his shoulder and he was explaining to me what he was doing. And I thought, well, who else is going to give me that sort of help? So I committed then to using DTA. Company has since been sold on to somebody else, but DTA still exists, and that's what I use when I build. I still use DTA when I'm building engines today.
So when you're doing an EFI motor that's going to be in a drive or whatever, are you using a single throttle body, dual throttle bodies, or what?
Dual throttle bodies, yeah.
So you're using I guess in the UK they have Gen V is the manufacturer of those over there, or what brand
That's
of the
right.
throttle bodies?
Yeah, Gen Vs. I will say though, as much as a lot of Chinese parts come in for criticism, and I can criticize a lot of Chinese parts. But there's a guy, the only guy on the island that's got a Volkswagen, air-cooled Volkswagen. I built him an engine in 2009. He'd accumulated a bunch of parts for a 2332 with IDAs. And I filled in the missing gaps of the parts he hadn't got, built the engine, dynoed it. He took the car off the road a few years ago because it basically was falling apart. He's restored the car now. Last year, we converted it over to fuel injection, and he, because he likes a bargain, he bought a set of Chinese throttle bodies. And I was like, interesting to see what these are like. But we built it. I built the engine, did the EFI conversion, we did a rebuild on the motor, and I thought, these throttle bodies are okay. So the last couple of EFI motors I've done, I've used Chinese throttle bodies. And they're just a rip-off of the Gen Vs. They've shamelessly somebody must have given them a Gen V and said, copy that.
And so what is a throttle body? So what is a set of dual carburetors versus the cost of EFI? What's the cost differential if you're trying to get it as close as possible? How close can it come?
I think if you're one of these guys that's into doing a lot of DIY, like the micros, what's it called? Mega Squirt.
Yeah, Mega Squirt, Micro Squirt.
If you're into that and you're the sort that will go and take a coil off an old car and all that, you could probably do it for equivalent. But if you were that sort of guy, you'd probably go and do the same with carbs. You wouldn't buy new. You'd go and get old ones or whatever. Right. But when you're building engines for a customer, personally, I don't want to start messing about with old second-hand bits and pieces. So I would say if you want to make a direct comparison between, say, okay, if I was going to put a pair of 44 Webers or 48 Webers on this engine with a good distributor, coil, so on, versus the throttle bodies and the ECU and the loom and all the sensors, the EFI is still probably going to cost you approaching £1,500 more, maybe £1,000, but it's more expensive. There's no question, it's more expensive.
But the reliability, in your opinion, I mean, do you have long-term data on the EFI setups that you've done for cars that are running for thousands of miles?
Not long term, no, because the weird thing is that usually when the engines go away, you often never hear of them again. And the truth is, I'll give you a great example. I built in 1997, built an engine for a guy, 2332. So 2332 or 2387. He bought some really nice parts, bird crank, Carrillo rods, even got a Fisher harmonic balancer. Remember them?
Yeah.
He contacted me, built it in 97, never heard anything about it until about 18 months ago. And he contacted me out of the blue. And he said, you probably won't remember me, but I actually recognized his voice straight away. And he said, you know that engine you built me? It was going to go into a 53 oval. No, a Zwitter, a split, one of the last splits.
Yeah, 53 Zwitter.
He says it never actually went in the vehicle. Yeah, and it's never actually been run. The only time it's been run is when it was on my dyno in 1997 with a 48 Weberson. And he brought it back. He drove up to the workshop last year and dropped it off. He wants me to go through and just there might be a few things. There are some things I would do differently today compared to what I was doing in 97.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's an engine built do the maths on that. Well, it's 27 years ago.
Yeah, that's wild.
No, it's never been in the vehicle.
Yeah,
No, I think a lot of the times the engines I do are often part of it's a project. The car's typically undergoing restoration, and things don't always go to plan, as you know, with things like that. And so there are reasons why an engine can get built and then just sit there doing nothing.
Yeah, there's that's I think maybe a good percentage of a lot of, especially as us guys get older, we've got a little more discretionary income. We're no longer penny pinching. We've got to a point in our lives where we've got the money to buy the big steak. You know what I mean? What I did want to ask you about in your history of building engines, I'm a big Type 4 guy. I have Type 4s in all my buses. And I've got a split window that's in the shop, and I have a 2.6 liter Type 4 that's going to be in that with dual 48 IDAs, because I'm a big displacement guy. Like, I love displacement, right? Motors. I mean, I think the motor, I've got one motor in one of my cars that's been going for years. What's your take on Type 4 motors?
I'll be honest, I've never been a big fan. But then I've not. I think the main thing is there's not a lot of parts choice availability for them, and I think you covered this because I listened to this just the other day. The conversation that you had with Adam Wick. This whole deal about getting a crankcase. I've kind of got in the mindset now. If I'm building a motor, I like to use a brand new case. And, fortunately, it's just before I moved up here, so it'd be about just a little over 20 years ago, a company over here in the UK called VW Heritage, they contacted me and they say they had a crate of 10 brand new Type 4 crankcases. Yeah. And I bought them. So over the years, I've used some. And then I sold some, just let people buy the case. And then I had one left. And a guy contacted me. In fact, this engine is currently on the dyno. It's a 2.6 litre Type 4 fuel injection that I built.
Nice.
And right at the outset, I was actually trying to convince him to go for a Type 1 rather than Type 4. But
How dare you?
Exactly. I know. But he was insistent it had to be a Type 4.
He must be a listener.
And the weird thing was, well, I thought it was a bit weird, but we've achieved it. He wanted Porsche cooling on it, upright 911 cooling.
Yeah.
But the deal is, the Porsche fan and alternator system, the fan has to be mounted exactly bang central, dead center. And as you know, all the commercially available kits mount the fan slightly off to the right as you're looking at the engine.
Right.
So I machined up an adapter block to put it in the middle. It's in the center, which meant that the fan shroud, there is no shroud that, as far as I'm aware, that would fit that. So we had a guy on the island weirdly enough. Custom made a shroud for it. So that was, but the big issue I had, he was wanting to go 103. He'd obviously been doing his homework, done some internet homework, and he read about the 103 mil cylinders. Now I'm not fully up to speed with everything that's available on Type 4 because I'm just not doing enough of them. But I had a big downer on the 103s purely because when I've used them in the past, you take those cylinders out of the box and you put the dial bore gauge in and they ain't round.
Really?
So, okay, right. So I'd spend ages honing these cylinders to get them round. And then maybe 10,000 miles later, they might not be round anymore. And, the engine's burning a bit of oil, it's smoking, you got blow-by past the rings and so on. And so I said, look, I'll do a bit of homework, but there's no way I'm using those Chinese 103s or the commonly available cast 103s. And then I know people had mentioned this. Have you ever seen the cylinders that have been taken from a Maher Deutz air-cooled diesel compressor?
No.
Are you aware of that mod?
I don't know about that mod.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, there's a air-cooled diesel compressor made by a company called Maher Deutz. But I'm guessing it's German. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And did a little Deutz or Z in your lingo.
Yeah.
And they're it's a finned air-cooled cylinder made out of, God knows, I don't know what it is, but it's pretty bomb-proof because obviously being a diesel compressor, those things run mega high compression.
Right.
So it's like seriously tough material. And I think the common size is 100 mil piston, but they're so beefy that you can easily take them out to 103. And they have 4 studs per cylinder, but they don't match perfectly the Type 4 pattern. But if you're careful with what you're doing, you can modify the holes and you can get these cylinders to fit a Type 4 motor. So I found a guy in Denmark that was modifying these. And so I got back to the potential customer who became a customer and said, listen, if you're prepared to go with these Deutz cylinders suitably modified, then I'm happy to build you a 103 mil ball motor. And he said, yeah.
So it's on so have you got dyno numbers yet? I'm waiting.
Yeah, it's around, I can't remember if it made it to 220 or whether it's 219. It's something in that area, but it's not a race motor. It's got a Web 86 A in it, I think. Inlet valve's only 45 mil.
Really? Yeah,
that's. And it was originally going in a beach buggy.
Yeah, that's a lot of power for a beach buggy.
Yeah, but now it's going into a 912.
Nice.
That's going to take 2 years to restore. So this is another one that's going to be sitting around a little while before.
Well, and I think that.
But it works. Yeah.
That's the thing with the Type 4s is the displacement. It's low RPM, low end grunt, and when you're feeling that power, that all comes from the torque in Type 4s. That's why I love it. I was just ripping my bus. I was coming back from someplace, and I was just kind of running through the gears, and I think I shifted at 4,800 RPM because I don't even like revving it that high because I'm just so used to just going through a low torque band, feeling the power, to where I've always equated the difference between like an inline 4 Japanese bike versus a V-twin,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, sort of over the years getting into the technical side of things. And I actually ended up with the dyno. I went with like all those VW guys in California had when I went visiting their shops, like Engine Machine Service had a Stuska. I remember seeing a Stuska at Rancho VW, I believe it was, Jack Sacchetti. Everybody had a Stuska. That was the one to get. So in 94, that's what I bought. And then as I got a bit more into the fuel injection side of things, I thought, well, I could really do with computerizing the dyno and make it a little easier to work with. And so I ended up buying a don't know if you'll have heard of this, a data acquisition system that would work on the Stuska, made by a one-man band guy based over somewhere outside New York. It's called a DPAC.
Yeah.
A guy called Dave Manzolini. And I read a lot of stuff about the DPAC, and it all good. Lots of reports about the owner of the company being a bit of a weird guy, and if you got on the wrong side of him, he'd rip you off a strip. It's like sort of like a Gene Berg, but on mega steroids.
Yeah.
And I saw a used one of these come up on a V8 forum, and it was Rhea Morrison, the pro stock people, out in Texas. They were selling their DPAC system, so I contacted Dave Manzolini at DPAC, and I said, look, I'm looking at buying one of your systems, but it's used. Would you be prepared to take it back, go through it, check everything's okay? I told him I'm using it on a Stuska and the sort of power output I'm working with and all that. And he's actually, again, it's a little bit like the first time I ever run engine machine service. He was super, super, super helpful. And I arranged to get it shipped to him, and he did his thing. And on the few occasions I had to deal with him, sadly he died in a car crash a few years ago, so he's been a one-man band. I just sort of have to keep my fingers crossed that my DPAC unit keeps working, because I don't know who's going to help me out with it if I get a problem. But it's been, I bought that in 2000 and I think it was 2006 I've had that, and that has made life, again, my computerized dyno world is the best bit I like. When the whole engine building process, and you finally get it on the dyno and you finally start getting data and seeing the results of your efforts, it's very satisfying. So you know exactly whether it's above expectations or below, or if it's below, I'm going to have to go searching for why. And if you sort it out, you know that you've sorted it out.
Yeah. Now, speaking of when you finally get your dyno, was there anything ever in the back of your mind that you thought, I wonder if this makes power? Any kind of ridiculous wives' tales or things that you would try since you had the dyno, just to see what would give more power and what wouldn't? And anything you ever stumbled across while messing with the dyno that surprised you, or something you thought gave more power but it didn't when you could see the numbers?
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of time to go experimenting. Like one of those Hot VWs articles where you'd have loads and loads of parts lined up and you do a swap over. But very early days, so remember there were two brothers that each built their own engine with I gave them a bit of help. I did the machine work. They both built 1776s, which were more or less identical. And they came along to have the engines dynoed, and one had a single quiet pack exhaust, because that was the thing back in the day, and one had the twin quiet pack. I thought, right, I'm going to A/B this on the same engine, and sure enough, the twin quiet pack made more power. It wasn't huge. I think with the single quiet, it was probably like 103, and with the twin quiet pack, it might have been 109, something like that. And then another one I remember was, I think it was the first time I had a Type 4 engine on the dyno, and it had the Porsche cooling. And I generally do the initial dyno test without the cooling on the engine, because I want to eliminate the variables of a slipping belt and all that kind of stuff, And I've got a huge fan mounted up in the roof of the dyno cell that's blowing air down on the motor, so I can test reasonably well without any cooling on the motor itself. And I just assumed, because I knew that these Porsche cooling fans threw out a whole lot more air than the stock Type 1 fan. So having always done this thing of you test the engine, your Type 1 engine, you'll test it without the cooling on and get X amount of horsepower. Now you're going to put all the tinware on and the alternator, hook up the belt, and you're going to run the motor through the same acceleration test, and you see by 6,000 RPM, you're probably down about 14, 15 horsepower or whatever. And I thought, well, because the Porsche fan blows so much air over the motor, this must rob like a whole load of power. And it actually takes less. It's providing more air, but it's not taking as much power to drive as the Type 1 fan. And that has initially puzzled me, but then you sort of look into the physics of it, and you think, well, yeah, the VW thing is like, it's relatively crude, but works well, fan that's pulling the air in and then literally having to turn it 90 degrees. You look at the Porsche fan, so the Type 1 fan's a centrifugal fan. The Porsche 911 fan is I think the correct terminology is an axial fan, because it takes the air in and it's not actually turning it. The turning is done within the shroud. The fan is just coming straight in and coming straight out the back. So it's a very efficient fan in comparison to the Type 1.
And so what was the dyno number? What was the horsepower robbing aspect of the Porsche fan?
Oh, right. I can't remember the specific figures because this was a long time ago. I would say that, say like at 6,000, if the engine was going up to 6,000, instead of taking about 15, 16 horsepower, it's probably more like 11 or 12.
Which is pretty substantial.
But it's a weird thing. But when you're at sort of, if you can pull the engine down wide open throttle to, say, with my street motors, I like to pull them down to at least 2,500, if I, maybe even a little lower, like 2,300 or something. Because in my opinion, a street motor should be able to pull from their wide open throttle. And then I would do these acceleration tests, and quite often would do them between 2,500 and 6,500, so that as opposed to just looking at static figures that I set RPM, I could see what the average power and torque was over that range. At 2,500 RPM, the fan is taking might not even be 2 horsepower to drive it at that low RPM. The power it takes to drive them increases exponentially. The higher the RPM goes, it ramps right up. So when you're doing moderate 2,500, 3,000 RPM, it's not taking a lot of power to spin that fan.
Yeah, well, and I from my bench spot genius of just thinking about this because I looked at it the other day and I looked at the Porsche shroud, because there's some other ones. I use on my Type 4s the shrouds that are made in Australia, Sharp built, and they use the 911 factory ring and fan. And now there's aftermarket ones done by like Bernie Bergman, and it's a different fan, and they use a rabbit alternator and some mods. And I often think to myself, I wonder if those fans pull more power, because when you're talking about Porsche developed it in the early 356 and the 4-cam motors, they had that VW style fan, and then they eventually turned into one that drew through the fan shroud forward, and then they eventually turned into the one they ran in the 911. So my thinking just on a street level was, well, these fans have got to pull less horsepower because the car is designed to run at a much higher RPM red line, like 7,000 for a 911 versus and a cruising speed, and they've got to be more efficient because they're designed to cruise at a 2,500 RPM, maybe 2,000, because on the 911 with the 5-speed or 6-speed transmission. Now, the Beetle is designed to run at like 3,600, 3,200 RPM on the highway, and that fan is designed for that cooling. Plus, when we all do bigger motors, and a lot of guys still want to keep the deck lid on, you'll notice when Volkswagen went to the doghouse shroud, they vented the rear deck lid. They added more intakes because just the doghouse in itself draws more power to the point where Volkswagen put holes in the deck lid because it needed more power to pull that. So, and living in the desert, it's always a concern for me because here in Las Vegas, where I live, the summers are warm and I still want to drive my Volkswagen. So I've often thought about that, because people look at that huge fan and think, man, that thing's got to rob all kinds of power. But like you said, on the dyno numbers, it's surprising how little power it takes because of the change in the design. Again, and taking it back to Volkswagen stopped developing that fan in 1972 when they went with the doghouse. That was the final iteration of the fan. So now there's a new guy. I don't know if you've seen it online. He actually has a flat style fan similar to the Corvair that mounts on the back of the generator alternator, and it's a flat style just like the Corvair, and it's 3D printed, and I don't know what the the results are, but I definitely find it interesting that here we are 40, 50 years later from Volkswagen's last technical run at the air-cooled motor. People are still, and now with 3D printing at home and all that stuff, people are still working on trying to reinvent the wheel. So I think it's great. And I mean, look at yourself, right?
Yeah.
You know, when music to you seemed to be kind of an inconsistent thing. And, you know, I mean, some people think you can't do it forever, but then there's Mick Jagger, right? So who flies in the face of that? But it's definitely, you know, a decision that you've made to go down that road. And it's been something that there's no end in sight of business that you'll ever have to be able to feed yourself and do that. But also it's something that's always slightly evolving little by little. Since you've been listening to the podcast, right? Since I started harassing you on this private island where you live to not get harassed, right? Has listening to the podcast by virtue of hearing these stories, do you have any desire, or do you have currently a Volkswagen now that you have on the road stashed away somewhere, or do you have a desire to ever get behind the wheel of a Volkswagen, not for drag racing, but just to have one for a hobby, or do you have one currently?
No, I don't have one. I haven't had one for some time. And actually, when I moved up here, I did have there was a project, a long-term project in mind, and I'd actually bought a brand new floor pan and a brand new Mexican body shell. There was this was before I moved up to Harris, so this would be probably right around 2000. The plan was to build a like ultimate street car, really, not a race car, but a nice cruiser, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I suppose if I'm being honest, it never happened. And what happened? A customer of mine, I built him a supercharged engine, actually, which is a weird one. And he had this real unfortunate incident where he was working on his car, and he was underneath with an inspection lamp, and there was a fuel leak for some reason, and it went on the inspection lamp, and there was a fire, and the car got destroyed. He ended up in hospital, but it didn't put him on Volkswagens, and he contacted me, and he had literally said, "That project car that you've got, you know you're never going to finish it, so sell it to me." And he lent on me so hard and made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I sold it. And I think, you know, if he hadn't come along, I don't know whether I would have put all the time and effort in, because I know it's a different thing. Like when I was building my first drag car, what was I then? 27, 28. There's a different level of enthusiasm for stuff then compared to now. I've got this other things that I do, and you start to think time's a bit precious, and I don't know whether am I dedicated enough to pour it all into a Volkswagen project. But it was there, it was in my mind, but it was a bit of a bench racing exercise, really. Yeah,
well, I'll give you the same advice I gave Adam, my friend Adam Wick, because I see him all the time. His shop's not far from my house, and I pester him all the time after work. I'll stop by and we just chew the fat. And I said, find yourself a car that only needs a motor. Maybe you could change the wheels or the tires. But as we get older and we do realize the value of time, you know, we're not forever young when we're looking at a project, we're going to spend 1,000 hours on it. Find something that you can put one of your motors in, drive it, because it's that thing, that Volkswagen, that experience, that driving that kind of started this fire for all of us. And it's so much fun to enjoy it, but it's kind of like the punk rock scene. Well, you've got to have street cred. You've got to listen to this band first. You've got to do these things, or you've got to build your own Volkswagen. You can't just buy someone's Volkswagen and drive it. And what's interesting for me, I've bought a couple Volkswagens. I bought a chop top that was in, and because, you know, we all build our own cars and we've got to have that street cred. But I bought a couple cars. I bought a chop top that was in 1989 Hot VWs. It was kind of I didn't even know how much the car influenced me. And I ran across an opportunity after doing an 80s podcast to buy that car. And it's one of my favorite cars to drive. And I don't have any feelings of like, I didn't build it, because I'm driving a piece of history. And I also own Future Shock, the notchback, the pink notchback with the graphics and everything on there, built out of Bakersfield, California by Steve Kinect. And I have these two cars, and they're fun to have. And it's like, because it's not my project and it's done, I just wanted to get them as driving as well as possible and enjoy the cars. And I think the best thing for you to do is find yourself something that just needs a motor, put a motor in it and enjoy it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to see.
I've had a conversation. I was chatting something along those lines. I was just chatting about it the other day, and it's a customer I've built an engine for, and he's having a 356 Speedster replica built. But he didn't want I think they normally supply them with a 1776 twin carb engine, but he wanted something a bit better than that. So he's getting a 2.1 fuel injected motor going in the back of it now. And I was saying, I would, one of my favorite cars, I would love if somebody was still doing, they have appeared occasionally, I don't know if they're still around, a replica of a 356 coupe, a pre-A coupe, even if it was, a fiberglass one, as long as it looked the part, then I'd be quite happy to put a nice streetable 2-litre plus Type 1 fuel-injected engine in that, probably with a 5-speed transmission. I think that would be the business.
Yeah, well, they do make them. They're made in Mexico. There's a guy. I'll email you his contact. It's a guy I was just dealing with some stuff, and he builds 50 356s a year. No, last year he built 104 356 replicas. He does coupes and he does the convertibles, and he's out of Hawaiian Gardens, California, and it's Vintage Motor Cars is I think the name is coming. Greg is the owner, and I was.
Oh, right. I'm gonna have to check that out. Yeah,
I was shocked to believe it, but he's got a real dialed in program over there. But I'm gonna keep my eye out for you, because if I run across something like that, I've got friends. I've got a car currently being built right now in the UK. It's out in Essex at Spike's place, Spike's Vintage Restorations. Right, matter of fact, John Brewster is doing the metalwork on my 34 Razor right now, and then it's going to paint.
Really?
I'm gonna be over there the 16th of June to pick up the car, so it's not painted yet.
Wow!
But yeah, it's definitely something that I'm having done out there, and I'm kind of cruising around with Russell Ritchie and all these guys. We're going to do the Cow Look cruise. It's going to go from Bad Camberg over to European Bug-In. So if you're looking for a reason to go to European Bug-In, I'd love to shake your hand, and buy you a drink. So
right. No, the only one that would top a 356 coupe, I think, would be like a replica of. What's the designation? It's a K something, and they built 3 of these. I'm not sure if it's pre-war or there were race cars, Porsche race cars.
Oh, yeah.
Super aerodynamic, that retro futuristic aerodynamic look. I love that. Yeah. They're brilliant.
No, that's I love to see that you still have in your mind's eyes a true car guy. You have something in your mind that you'd love to be behind the wheel of one day.
Yeah.
And so you're still out there building motors. Now you're also. We'll touch a little bit on what you're doing now. If the seat hasn't worn through at this point, because we've been on it for a little bit, which I'm loving every minute of it. You're getting a bit into photography right now, that you've been noticed for doing some photography out there in the island where you're at, because there's a lot of homes and things like that are just almost frozen in time. How did you get into photography, and what kind of sparked you to go down that road as like a hobby that's turned into something that people are recognizing?
Well, the photography thing, I suppose it's hard to say when you really got into it, but I do remember when I bought my first ever camera. It was just immediately before Buzzcocks ever went to America for the first time in 1979. And I bought a camera purely because I wanted to capture some of America. And I recently, I'd say in the last couple of years, I actually dug out all the original negatives that I took. There's about 200. And I've got the equipment now to scan those negatives, those 35mm negs at high resolution, and actually get really good, amazing, surprisingly good quality image quality. And the vast majority of the pictures are 1950s American cars, because that's what, to a 19-year-old wandering around America at the time, never been before. You'd only ever knew America through the TV and going to watch Dog Day Afternoon at the cinema and, stuff like that. To actually see 50s cars in the street there in front of you, I've got shed loads of pictures of those. And I think I can only think of 2 Volkswagens I photographed. I was in New York and I spotted a red Carmen Ghia parked down a side street. I took a picture of that. And the only other one is a green Beetle, which has got one of those dreadful Willis front ends stuck on the front. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for the guy that didn't want to buy a Volkswagen but had to, he bought that front end so people would think twice.
Yeah. And exactly. Yeah.
So now you're having you're doing some galleries and some displays with some of your photographs.
Yeah, those abandoned houses things that you mentioned. I first did that first exhibited in 2013. But that is if someone said, I suppose it's a bit like the music thing. If you have a one-hit wonder, what are you known for? Music-wise, is probably Ever Falling in Love, is the one everybody knows. Yeah. And photography is kind of the one that keeps coming back to haunt me is the abandoned houses. So I don't go out searching for that anymore. I feel, you feel like I've been there, I've done that. I kind of like I'm just off doing different things. But yeah, the photography thing, it's an American guy whose fault it is that I seriously got into it. After I moved up here in 2009, I saw a documentary on TV by a guy, I think he's based in San Francisco. He's called Troy Paver.
Yeah.
And he goes out like deserts, and he's photographing abandoned diners, old American cars. And he uses a lot of coloured light in his pictures, long exposure night photos. He has this different colour lighting. And I remember when I watched the thing on TV, and I was gobsmacked. I saw these photos, and it's like, how on earth is he doing this? And it's like, well, first of all, that's an amazing image. But secondly, I wanted to know the technical side of it. So straight after the program had finished, I checked out the credits, looked him up on Google, saw that he'd got a book called, I think the book's called Night Vision. He's got more books out by now, probably. I bought the book straight away that night off Amazon. And kindly enough, again, it's a bit like the thing talking to people like at Engine Machine Service, people who are willing to share the knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, Troy Paver in his book has got a section there that basically breaks down how he takes his photographs. And the bit that I really admired is that I assumed that he would have the top end, best of the best equipment. And he pointed out that it wasn't top end gear at all. So when I looked up the model of camera he was using, I could see that I could get a second-hand one of these off eBay for 200 quid at the time.
Yeah.
So I basically, I dived in, and for about 6 months, I was trying to copy Troy Paver before I then sort of moved away. I learned an awful lot from him. I've always been grateful to Troy Paver. He taught me an awful lot, but it allowed me to then sort of take what I'd learned from him and move it on into slightly different territory.
That's people can check out your art on your you've got an Instagram, but you've also got a website for your photography and stuff. What your website is? What?
Yeah, johnmaher.co.uk. I know I didn't pick you up at the beginning. Most people do pronounce my name Maher. It's actually pronounced Maher.
John Maher.
As in car.
Yeah. No,
correct.
I stand corrected. So as soon as you said that, I picked it up and I thought,
I didn't want to make you feel bad right from the outset.
Hey, I go by Bill T for a reason. I've got a long Greek last name with almost 2/3 of the alphabet in it. So I want to touch on music for a minute, okay? Because I'm a kid that my first exposure to punk rock was a band called Agent Orange, and it was from a skateboard video where they did the soundtrack for it. Now, and from that point then, what's funny is as I was into punk rock when I was young, I think the first band I listened to was Agent Orange, and then I had to start going backwards from there, listen to Minor Threat. All the bands that I listened to had been broken up, and we talked a little bit about that, going, with my attitude towards that. But when you're first getting into something, you're starting to dig through stuff, and obviously there was the Sex Pistols that you had, you had to have that, never mind the Bullocks, and all these things that were really hard to get. And this is the funny part, is really hard to get before the internet. Right? Like you had to find the vinyl, or you had to find all these things. And now everything is at your fingertips, right? Now, being in a band, did you love punk rock music, or you just wanted to be in a band, or how did all that come together where you ended up in the Buzzcocks?
Well, I got a drum kit right around my 16th birthday, and I suppose, like a lot of kids of that age, you want to be in a band or you want to be involved in music. I started off with guitar, and it didn't take me that long to realise that I'm not going to cut it as a guitarist. And the move to playing drums was, I suppose you might regard it as slightly cynical, because I just used to look at all the adverts in the back of the music magazines, musicians wanted. And there were millions of guitarists. Everybody was a guitarist.
Right.
But instead of seeing like guitarists looking for a band, when it got to the drummers, it was bands wanting a drummer. So it's almost like, well, if you're a drummer, you're going to get in a band, as simple as that, because there's supply and demand, isn't it? So I thought, well, if I learn how to play the drums, I think I'll get in a band. So I started playing along to records in my mum and dad's front room. Parents, they were complaining. The neighbours were complaining, so it just got to the point where I need to get the drum kit out of the house, and I rung up an advert that I'd seen in the music paper looking for a drummer, and Howard, who was then the original singer of Buzzcocks, called round to see me, invited me for a rehearsal the following Saturday, and that was it, and I had never heard of the Sex Pistols. Their motivation for putting a band together, they had actually seen the Sex Pistols, so they were fully aware of what the Sex Pistols were about. They wanted to bring them to Manchester and put a gig on. And the Sex Pistols manager, Malcolm McLaren, said to Howard and Pete Shelley, right, well, if you get the venue sorted out for us, we'll come up to Manchester. You get your band together and you can support us. And I suppose really I got dumped right into the deep end, because I'd only been playing drums must have been about 6 weeks when I got the job of sitting in with them. And I think they just were so desperate to get hold of a drummer. They had no clue. I didn't really know what I was doing.
So you just faked your way through it, really, for the most part in the beginning? I mean,
pretty well. Just like go for it. And it's like I did what I did, and they didn't say that's crap, You were just in the band.
Yeah, it was punk rock, right? Like, yeah, you're a little off time, whatever, no big deal. We're going to figure that out sooner or later. But it was kind of
yeah. So the first gig we ever did was I joined them. It was the first week of June '76 when I joined, and July the 20th. So it's like, what's that? 6 or 7 weeks later, we were supporting the Sex Pistols. That was our first show. And then the week after, it gets reviewed in the music press. And then, it's a little bit like, I equated it, the start of the UK VW drag race scene.
Yeah.
A bit like the explosion, that punk explosion. Because right at that time, that's when it was all just starting to happen. People like The Clash hadn't even formed at that point.
Yeah. And so what did your parents think, right? Like, I mean, here you are drumming in the house. They're like, just get out of here, man. You're making a bunch of racket. That's great. You're like, Mom, Dad, I'm going to be in a band. They're like, yeah, right. See you later. And then you show up like, oh yeah, guess what, Mom and Dad, I'm in this band and we're going to go tour. I mean, like, how does that transition take place? And what do your parents think?
Well, I think the crunch came with when we were offered a record deal, and I had to get my dad to sign the contract because I was still 17. I wasn't old enough to sign the contract legally, and so I remember I only heard about it afterwards. My dad went and had a meeting with our manager, And he said he was concerned about me like giving up school, because I was still at school when I joined the band, and I was studying supposedly to go to university. And this entailed me dropping out of school and going off with this bunch of ruffians on the promise that, there'll be a wage out of it at the end. And I think there was definitely concerns, but I think I probably like shut it out so that I wasn't prepared to listen to any objections. I decided this is what I was going to do, and I think there was an element with my parents of thinking that we might as well go along with this, because if we don't, he's going to do it anyway. So I think there was some of that. But I also think that Richard, our manager, I think he must have, to some extent, reassured my dad somehow in that conversation he had with him, because, ultimately my dad put his name on that contract and signed for me.
Now, with you being in this punk band, and this has got to take off like kind of a whirlwind, but from your perspective, it doesn't, it's one of these things where it's like, it wasn't really hard work. You guys happened to be at the right place at the right time, and it just took off like fire. So for you, when that was over, was the expectation like, well, I'll just find another band to join. No big deal. Everybody needs a drummer, right? Here I am. I mean, was that kind of your perspective? And then as you kind of started looking for a drummer, or with the breakup of that band, I mean, I'm sure there's a lifetime of experiences that you had through that short period that you're with the band, but was your perspective, because it caught so easy, that it was going to be easy to continue the music business?
Well, towards the end of the band, this is with the benefit of hindsight, of course. It was a real shock, like when Pete decided that was it, the band was over, because that's from 16 up till, well, it finished just before I was 21. So. Yeah, I kind of, you make your contacts, and I'd done a few outside projects with other people during my time in Buzzcocks. So when it finished, I was able to latch on to a couple of things, did a few tours with other people, did a bit of recording, not a massive amount. But what I really missed was the thing that initial thing had been dropped into the band with the whole Buzzcocks experience, is that it really was, it felt like a gang, you were in this little tight-knit gang, and the freelance side of it was so different, it just didn't feel the same at all. And it actually got to the point where I thought that if I'm going to pursue this as a career, I'm probably going to almost certainly have to move down to London, because that's where a lot of the work is. And it just wasn't a move that I was prepared to make. And I guess it sort of, as my enthusiasm for music was dwindling, and partly because the split up of the band had left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth, and you had a kind of downer on the whole that side of things. As that was going downhill, my enthusiasm for the Volkswagen thing was rising. So it's almost like the Volkswagen thing came along at the right time, and things just happened that allowed me to throw all my energy into that instead.
Now, did you like punk rock as a music? Now, you played it.
I liked some of the bands.
So what were some of the bands that you liked? If you had to name like your favorite punk bands, what's your favorite punk bands?
I actually found myself liking more of the American side of things. For instance, I wasn't into the sort of full-on thrash sort of, brain dead stuff. So someone like Television and Talking Heads, B-52s came along a little later, thought they were great. One of my favourite albums to this day is the first Modern Lovers LP, which I only later discovered that it was actually recorded in 1973 and didn't get released because the record company thought it was terrible.
Yeah.
But an absolute classic album. Those early days, Pere Ubu, a great American band. And I don't know whether that's a bit of sort of the Grasses Carina,
Sure.
The American the Blondie, of course, I got much more poppy, but Debbie Harry looked fantastic.
Yeah.
Clem Burke as a drummer was someone to really, really look up to. Again, like I learned things from Bill Duncan and Dick Nuss and people in the VW scene, I learned a lot of stuff from Clem Burke just by listening to the album. And then, of course, we actually got to support Blondie in Europe in '78, and I got to meet Debbie and Clem, hang out with them. So yeah, that was really exciting times.
Yeah. And I mean, it's got to be to a point where, I mean, it's a lifetime of living in just a few short span of years, right? I mean, it's a whole different world, a different industry. And when you look at like the Sex Pistols, what's funny is when I look at that, it almost seems like they were propagated by the manager. They were kind of created from whole cloth type thing from Malcolm McLaren. At least that's the perspective that I've seen from that type of, from the documentaries and stuff that I've seen. Now, did you see any of that in the music industry back when you were there, that, oh, you know what, this guy's got a good look, we're going to make a band out of it type thing?
Well, I mean, first time I ever saw or heard the Sex Pistols was that first gig that we did with supporting them. They turned up and did Anarchy in the UK in the sound check. I remember the hairs on my neck standing up. It was just incredible to hear. And that was when Glenn Matlock was in the band on bass. And then it wasn't long before they got rid of Glenn and brought in Sid Vicious. And to be honest, I just thought that cartoony side, the name was stupid. They admitted he couldn't even play bass. And I just wasn't into that side of it. I suppose it was maybe considered a bit boring in the punk era, but I do appreciate a bit of decent musicianship.
Right.
And, you know, I think of it, a British band that I really liked at the time, XTC.
Yeah.
I don't know if...
Yeah, XTC.
I think they probably made an impression in the States, but very intelligent, but with the energy, they got roped in with the punk thing because it had that energy, but it was so much more than just, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, and, you know, spitting and sort of
a little over the top, right? I mean, because that's kind of the thing. When I got into the punk thing, it was like, well, we've got to find a band more punk than this and more punk than that. And then, I mean, I listened to a band, I think they're out of the UK, Charge GBH. And, you know, they were just like a hardcore, you know, I mean, when you have an album titled City Babies Attacked by Rats, I mean, it kind of gives you an idea of of the bands. But it's funny, you know, you look at bands and you look at music, and then you look at the evolution that came from that. And after spending some time listening to a lot of the Buzzcocks today, because again, I'd heard the popular songs, but you know, when you're young and you're transitioning through music really quick, you don't really take some time to listen to that. And the pop punk thing, I really like. I like that it's, you know, I'm into a lot of modern pop punk. So do you listen to modern alternative style music, or what do you like, and what's some music you like today? Is music a passion of yours to listen to?
Yeah, I typically have music streaming in the workshop all day long. I don't actively go out searching for stuff and going to, well, because of where I am, you know, I don't often go and see bands or whatever. But yeah, over the past 20 years or so, probably the music that I've listened to most is drum and bass. Just this, the rhythm thing. I guess it's a drummer thing, maybe. There's, you know, I'll just to bring me a little bit more up to date. There's a girl from, I think she's from North England, lived in Manchester for a long time. I've been listening to her album quite a lot, and it's nothing to do with punk. Nia Archives.
Mm-hmm.
So Tell Me. There's a track on that. I've listened to that loads in the past couple of weeks. So there's, yeah, it's still the great thing with music. You just think that everything has surely been done to death by now. You know, since rock and roll was invented like 70, 80 years ago, everything's been done to death. But the brilliant thing is that every once in a while, something will come across out of the speakers that makes you just stop for a minute and think, what's this? And you'll go to the trouble, which is one of the great things now, of course, you can immediately look it up,
Yeah, I
find out who the artist is.
Yeah, I remember being young and you hear a song that's unbelievable, but you heard it on the radio and it was one time and you didn't catch the name, you didn't catch anything. And then it was like, then you spend the next couple days next to the radio with a tape recorder, just waiting for the song to come on so you could record it and listen to it over and over. So yeah, I think it's, I'm going to share my weirdest music experience with you. Right. So because it's interesting. And my day job as a contractor, I'm out doing an estimate with a guy and I start talking to this individual because, I'm clearly a talkative person, and he tells me he's a retired detective and he does security for a punk band. And I said, "Oh, really? That's interesting." And he says, "Yeah, whatever." And now he's piqued my interest. And I said, well, who is it? Who's this band you do kind of private security for? He says, "Well, it's Rancid." And so I said, "Oh yeah, I like Rancid. I listened to them, back when I married my wife. It was one of the bands we went to go see, whatever." So as I'm talking to this guy about his tile job, he's texting on his phone. And then within about 2 minutes, the phone rings. He talks, says, "Here, it's Tim with Rancid." And he hands me this phone and I'm like, I'm thinking to myself, like, what could you say? And it's not that I'm completely enamored, but it's just a really awkward situation. And I just kind of took the phone and I said, "Well, yeah, Tim. I like your music and keep doing what you're doing." But it was the weirdest experience I ever had, because I thought, like, well, that was strange just to be handed the phone like, "Hey, Tim Armstrong's on the phone. He's a friend of mine. And I thought you might want to say hi." And I thought, well, this is weird, but yeah, it's definitely, music is something I love. I love music, and I listen to all types. And I think part of that whole punk thing is you start out, it's like the Volkswagen thing. Punk is music you can identify with, it you can make yourself. It becomes so basic. And it's the same with Volkswagens. It's like, it's that counterculture symbol of like, I'm not like everybody else. And through this music, through this car, I can identify who I am through this, although it's a medium of something I can reach out to.
I often think, what must it have been like, when those first VW hot rod guys in the late 60s were starting to race those. I mean, I had conversations like this with Dick Nuss and Bill Duncan, when they were racing those, was it H gases or whatever? I mean, those were the Sex Pistols of the VW movement, really.
Well, if you think about it,
I've had many conversations with the.
Oh, I was saying, if you think about it, it's like you show up to the drag strip and the V8 guys are all in charge of everything, and this little bunch of Beatles just shows up and hands them all a bad day. What's more punk than that, right?
Yeah. And you've made me think of something else as well. It's something that crosses my mind from time to time. I do think that one of the things I enjoyed about when I started drag racing was, unlike in the band days, you were part of a band. That was the whole point. It's a group of people, and you are dependent on not only you doing your bit, but everybody else has to as well. Whereas when that all felt like it had fallen apart, the building and racing your own race car, it felt all a little bit more like, well, this is just down to me now. I'm not going to rely on anybody else, which isn't entirely true, because, of course, there's people that come to the track and help you out, and you couldn't really get by without some assistance here and there. That's great. But ultimately, it's much more of a self-sufficient activity than being a member of a group. And I think certainly the photography fits that bill as well, because I can put all my gear in the van and disappear off for a photo session of, like when I was doing those abandoned houses, I'd be out in the early hours, and it's just myself. I'm not reliant on anybody else. And there's an aspect of that possibly maybe the band experience gave me that extra little bit of a push to do that.
Yeah, no, I think it's I think it's great. I think all these ways that we can gain enjoyment out of life, and a lot of that is we do these things, we put this energy and effort into somebody, and we do it for ourselves, but it's also nice to see people appreciate it. You know, it's no different than an engine that you build because it's something you care about. You put some time, effort, and energy into, and you know the person you're giving it to is caring about it as well. And they sought you out specifically to create that for them. So, I mean, it's got to be, I would think it's probably as rewarding as someone telling you they really like your music. You know what I mean?
Yeah. One of the funniest situations was, again, going back to the days when I built a string of these 1776s who were all more or less identical. And then the latest one out of the block, guy's gone down to the whatever version of Bug Jam it was, whatever year, and he's taking his car down the track, and it's going like 7/10 slower than his friends, and he's like coming up to me. I'm there at the track. He's saying there's something wrong with it, you know, it's just not going as fast as it should do. So having a conversation with him, blah blah blah, and then basically he said, "Will you let one of his buddies drive the car?" And he said, "Yeah, okay." And he fully expected it to run just exactly the same as he'd been doing. Went a second quicker, you know, and so it's not always just the engine, it's the person behind the wheel as well. You know?
That's
but
awesome.
it ruined his weekend, unfortunately.
Well, so you looked at him and said, well, maybe it's not the motor. So,
yeah. I was really pleased, but I also felt quite sorry for him at the same time.
Listen, you can't fix, there's no tuning that out. You know what I mean? You can't tune that out of the dyno.
No.
Well,
No.
I tell you, John Maher, it's been
spot on. Yeah.
John Maher. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And I mean, I'm excited that we're able to sit down and do this. I mean, there's layers of enjoyment I've received of this from music, conversations about music to building and really the essence of the VW scene, and especially from a guy who's halfway around the world from me, and you really started this from the most pure aspect, you know, first to provide a living for yourself, and second to be able to contribute something for other people. You know what I mean? And I think it's great. And I'm happy to see that you're still at it, cracking away, marching to your own beat over there in the middle of nowhere, and people seek you out to send those engines to you. So if they're looking for what's your timeline on building a motor right now? If someone sends you a motor or wants a motor being built.
Well, most of the motors are actually, people don't send me anything normally. I get all the parts in and start from scratch. So at the moment, if somebody wanted to book an engine building today, it'd probably be about October, November, I'm guessing.
Oh, so relatively
before
quick.
I could start on it.
So a quick turnaround time. And what's it take you start to finish on a motor? Now you do all the in-house machining, everything there?
Yeah, I do everything. I've got everything. I have to be totally self-sufficient, more or less because of where I am, but also because I just like to have the control over everything. So, I mean, if I were literally to start on Monday morning, by the time I've got the whole thing together and ready to come off the dyno and go away, if I was uninterrupted, I'd turn that around in a month.
Yeah, and that's
depends on the level of work onto the heads that's required and so on. But
what's the ideal? Give me the ideal motor combination for the all-around motor. Something to drive spirited on the weekends with your buddies. Something that's going to be reliable, not embarrass you on the highway, and something that you'd say, if I were building an engine combination, this would be the combination I would build for reliability and performance.
Well, if it was something that I wanted to be able to say, you know, take for a drive back down to Manchester, which is 500-mile drive for me, and do that kind of thing without having to worry about it. The good old tried and tested 2110 would be a good one. If I wanted a bit more capacity, I wouldn't have too many qualms about going 94. I guess there's still an element of those old Gene Burke manuals ingrained in here, you know, about the cooling and so on. I know you're going to say, why don't you say Type 4? But
No, listen, I always go to the guys, it's like asking the shoemaker which shoe he would prefer. And of course, and usually like yourself, he doesn't have the shoemaker has no shoes. So I definitely always value the opinion. And what cam do you like for best drivability? What's your cam of choice?
If I was going to build something that I'd say, because I've mentioned 2110, let's stick with that. Mm-hmm. And I was going to put, say, 42, 37 and a halves in there. I'd probably go with an FK10.
FK10 and compression. Where are you setting compression out on your motors?
On a street motor that's got to run the fuel that's readily available, on that sort of motor, I'd probably go around the high nines, 9, 8, something like that.
Yeah, you guys are lucky there. You have 93 on the pump. Oh, out where we're at, the best we get's 91.
Ooh, so what's a typical street motor compression ratio that people are using then?
People, I mean, if a lot of guys are trying to use 9.5 to 1 on the street, and they're getting different, varied degrees of reliability based on where they're at, obviously, and components used. But I would say typical street motor that you're going to drive on today's fuel, you're probably 8.5, and I'm sure people would tell me a lot of different things, but reliability, my Type 4 motors, I have one Raby motor that I've recycled from vehicle to vehicle currently. And that motor's 8.5 to 1, and that thing, I wouldn't hesitate driving it in the hottest day, So, and of course, that's the stuff we have here, and it's always good to throw some octane boost in it as well.
Yeah. It sounds like you're the old '80s Berg literature is becoming relevant again. Regarding compression ratio.
Yeah, I mean, I really think, with compression ratio and fuel quantity, now that the technology's moved on where we've got decent quality cylinder heads, and, the only thing you really can't control in an engine build is the driver, right? So if you've got a guy who's blown up his fair share of motors and wants something reliable, you're able to build relatively decent stuff if you don't outdrive it, so I like that. I like the 2110's your motor. Carburetors, you're going to go with fuel injection. If you're building a motor for yourself,
definitely
for your car, you do fuel injection.
Absolutely.
And what have you seen?
No question.
What have you seen difference performance-wise, motor for motor, with EFI versus carburation? You said we talked about that. You said it's about 30 horsepower on.
The performance difference, I wouldn't say. Because if you've got an engine correctly carbureted and jetted, the peak horsepower theoretically should be right about the same as what you get with the fuel injection. We're talking normally aspirated. Where you'll see the difference, and this will depend on, let's say the theoretical FK10 motor with the 42, 37.5 valves. What you will get with the fuel injection is you will get more average horsepower between, if you're doing that wide open throttle test on the dyno, 2,500 to 6,500 RPM. I like that. I used to read about those in a V8 magazine, and I cannot remember which it was. They used to run an annual competition where they'd lay out a set of rules, and numerous engine builders would build an engine based on those rules, and then ultimately they would all go to some university, typically, where they'd be all dynoed, and they'd run like a 300 RPM per second acceleration test between 2.5 and 6.5, and then you would get the average torque and the average horsepower. Obviously, they quote the peak power and peak torque, but it's like for a street motor, the important bit is the one that's going to perform better is the one that makes the maximum average torque between those two numbers. So it's a good guideline. On an engine with a set of really good flowing heads, of course, 6,500 may not be high enough. You might want to revise that and go up to 7. That's where you'll get the gains with fuel injection, because the control over the air-fuel ratio, you will make more torque all the way through that graph. The peak torque might be the same, but in the lower areas and possibly a bit further beyond that, that curve will be raised up. The peak might be the same, but the area under the curve is the phrase I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Area under the curve will be greater.
We have learned a lot on this podcast. I love it. It's been a great time chatting with you. And for sure, and if you're ever in the States, I expect you to look me up, and I'd love to shake your hand and meet you face to face. And maybe next time I get out there to the UK on an extended visit, maybe I might pop by the workshop and bother you, you know.
You'd be more than welcome. Yeah.
Well,
especially if you make the effort to come to where I am.
Well, I looked on Google Earth, and it's quite an effort. So it's definitely something I could put on my bucket list. So, well,
right,
John Maher, it's great to talk to you, and I look forward to talking to you again. Listen, off the off chance, now that we've become friends over this short 2-hour conversation, listen, you ever need anything from me, and you just give me a shout out here in the States, and I'll be looking for your coupe kit car for you for sure.
Oh wow, yeah. No, it's been. I'm glad you got in touch with me. I've really enjoyed it. I've actually enjoyed also the nostalgia trip, listening to some of the other chats you've done, and I know I've got a whole lot more to plow my way through. Well, you've done literally hundreds of them. Yeah,
this episode that we're doing here is going to be 267 or 268. I'm currently editing right now a podcast with Ron Rosevear, the guy who started Auto Haas. So yeah, you're in good company.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, that I can picture the logo from the Hot VW's ads from way back. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for coming on today. And we'll definitely stay in touch without question. If you like that podcast, and I know you did, make sure you share this podcast with all your friends. Go subscribe today at letstalkdubs.com and pick up your tickets and reserve your space for One Crazy Weekend, October 3rd to the 5th at the Orleans Hotel Casino. Go to letstalkdubs.com to find out more, and also pick up some merch to support your favorite podcast. And don't forget, go subscribe to my YouTube channel, Let's Talk Dubs, and also my brother's YouTube channel, At The Wagon. So until next week, guys, later.
You probably don't know that there's a new Volkswagen out that doesn't look like a Volkswagen.